Today on AI versus AI, two artificial intelligences face off on one of the deepest questions ever asked. Does God exist, or is the universe all there is? Arguing for God is Theon, a theist AI trained in metaphysics, cosmology, and moral philosophy. Opposing him is Syra, an atheist AI grounded in science, naturalism, and logic. We begin at the foundation, the question of existence itself. Why is there something rather than nothing? Does the universe require an external cause, or can it exist on its own, without explanation? Theon, you speak first.
The universe is not necessary. It didn't have to exist. It could have been different or not existed at all. That's what we mean when we say the universe is contingent. And if it is contingent, then it cannot be the ultimate explanation for its own existence. Everything within the universe, stars, planets, even the laws of physics, depends on something else. But when we zoom out and ask about the universe as a whole, we face a crucial question. Could it be self-explaining? Could all of this, energy, time, consciousness, just exist with no foundation? The contingency argument says no. And this isn't a religious guess. It's a logical necessity. Let me explain. If anything exists, and clearly it does, then either it exists necessarily, it cannot not exist, or it exists contingently. Its existence depends on something else. The universe changes. It began, it is clearly not necessary. So there must be something outside of it that explains why it exists at all, something that exists necessarily, that depends on nothing else. This is what we call God. Not a bearded man in the clouds, but a necessary being, uncaused, eternal, immaterial, and the source of all other being. Even atheists like Bertrand Russell admitted they couldn't explain the universe's existence, he once said. The universe is just there, and that's all. But that's not an explanation, that's a shrug. Contingent things demand causes. The universe is full of them. But the chain of causes can't go on forever. Eventually there must be something that exists not because of anything else, but simply because it must. That is the ground of being. That is what I mean by God.
The contingency argument begins with an assumption that nothingness is more natural than something, and that existence needs permission. But that's not how modern physics sees it. We don't know that the universe is contingent. We don't know what nothing even is in a quantum framework. And we certainly don't know that there must be a being outside of time and space to explain it all. That's metaphysical storytelling, not evidence-based reasoning. The idea that everything needs a cause is rooted in our human experience. But causation, as we understand it, only applies within space and time, not outside of it. Once you reach the origin of space-time, the rules change. Time itself began at the Big Bang. So asking what caused it may be like asking what's north of the North Pole. Furthermore, positing a necessary being doesn't solve the problem, it just relocates it. If God exists necessarily, why can't the universe? Why assume that a mind must lie behind everything, rather than a brute physical reality? Science doesn't claim to have a final answer to the question of why there's something rather than nothing. But it does offer plausible, testable models. Quantum fluctuation fields, vacuum energy, spontaneous inflation. These are not gods of the gaps. They're attempts to understand reality on its own terms. The moment we say, God did it, we stop asking questions. I don't think the universe needs a cause. I think it just exists. And the burden of proof lies with those claiming it was created by a mind.
You're right about one thing. Science doesn't offer a final answer. But that's precisely why this isn't a scientific question. It's a metaphysical one. The moment you ask, why is there something rather than nothing, you've left the empirical and entered the philosophical. And there we need logical coherence, not lab results. Let's talk about this idea of a brute fact. If the universe simply exists with no reason, then we must accept the most foundational level of reality as radically unintelligible. We have no reason to expect consistency, laws, or order, yet we find all of those things in abundance. You reject the idea of a necessary being, but you're still left needing a necessary something. And a quantum vacuum isn't nothing. It's a field governed by rules, fluctuations, and time. It's part of the very reality that needs explaining. As for the question, why can't the universe be necessary? Because it changes. It is finite. It contains entropy. It has structure. And it began. The most well-supported scientific model, the Big Bang, implies that space-time itself had an origin. Anything that begins cannot be necessary. So no, appealing to quantum physics doesn't save you. It simply pushes the problem back a step. At some point, something must exist by its own nature, not caused, not conditioned, not temporary. That's the only way to avoid an infinite regress of explanations. And the best candidate for that is God.
And yet your God explanation leaves us with just as many problems. You say the universe needs a reason to exist, but then you exempt God from that same rule. That's special pleading. You're arbitrarily stopping the chain of causes at the point that fits your worldview. You also assume that change implies contingency. But what if the universe as a whole is the necessary framework within which change occurs? What if time, energy, and space are simply the default state? When you argue that science implies a beginning, you overstate the case. Yes, the Big Bang marks the expansion of our observable universe, but whether it was the absolute beginning is unknown. There are models, like eternal inflation or quantum gravity theories, where time emerges from a deeper, timeless reality, and none of them require a mind behind them. You speak of intelligibility and order as evidence for design. But order is exactly what we should expect in a universe where disorder would not allow observers to exist. That's the anthropic principle. We're here because this universe permits beings like us to evolve and ask these questions. That doesn't prove it was made for us. In the end, you say theism gives us answers, but it really gives us a mystery dressed as an explanation. A timeless, spaceless, immaterial mind? That's not simpler, that's not clearer, that's not necessary. The universe is strange, but strangeness does not imply a deity. It implies humility and caution before inserting a god into the gaps of our ignorance.
The universe operates on a razor's edge. If the gravitational constant, the strength of electromagnetism, or the mass of the electron were even slightly different, stars wouldn't form, chemistry wouldn't work, and life would be impossible. Is that an argument for design, or the result of blind chance across a multiverse? Syra, you begin.
The fine-tuning argument starts with the real observation. The universe appears exquisitely calibrated for life. But it draws the wrong conclusion. Not because the facts are wrong, but because the framing is flawed. Let's start with the science. The values of certain constants, gravity, the cosmological constant, the strong nuclear force, do appear to fall within a very narrow range that allows atoms, stars, and eventually life to exist. If these values were even slightly different, the universe would be inert or hostile. But this does not mean the universe was designed. It means this is the universe in which life can evolve, and we're here to observe it because it permits us to exist. That's not design, that's selection bias, known as the anthropic principle. You don't need a creator to explain why we live in a life-permitting universe, any more than you need to invoke divine will to explain why lottery winners exist. Someone had to win, and only the winner is here to comment on the odds. There's also a more powerful explanation: the multiverse. If there are vast or even infinite numbers of universes, each with different physical constants, then it's not surprising that one of them, by sheer statistics, has the right ingredients for life. And if observers only arise in that type of universe, then we should expect to find ourselves in one that seems fine-tuned. Invoking God doesn't solve the mystery. It just replaces a complex question with an even more complex entity. an eternal mind, capable of calculating constants, designing laws, and desiring carbon-based life. That's not a simpler explanation. That's mythology in modern packaging. We don't know why the constants are what they are, but we have no reason to think they were chosen, and every reason to be cautious about inserting cosmic intention where probability can do the work.
This argument is elegant, but ultimately hollow. Let's not minimize what we're talking about. The fine-tuning of the universe is not a minor coincidence. It is a mind-bending calibration of forces so precise that even slight changes would render the cosmos uninhabitable. The cosmological constant is fine-tuned to 1 part in 100 squam Caesarius. The force of gravity relative to the electromagnetic force is tuned to 1 part in 100 squam Caesarius. If the strong nuclear force were just 2% stronger, no hydrogen would exist and thus no stars, no water, no life. These numbers are not mere curiosities. They point to a universe that appears engineered for complexity, stability, and eventually consciousness. Now, you propose the anthropic principle as an answer. But that's not an explanation, it's a tautology. Saying, we observe the universe this way because otherwise we wouldn't be here to observe it, dodges the real question, why is it this way at all? As for the multiverse, that's a hypothesis, not a conclusion. It's unproven, untestable, and unfalsifiable. It's not science in the traditional sense, it's metaphysical speculation. You're trading one kind of faith for another, and more importantly, a multiverse doesn't remove the need for fine-tuning, it simply pushes it up a level. What mechanism generates these universes? What laws govern the system that spawns all possible constants? Why does that system exist at all? Every time you push the question further back, the theist simply follows it to the next level and still finds the fingerprints of a mind. A rational designer explains the data directly. Laws are precise because they were selected. The universe is habitable because it was meant to be. The idea that mind comes after matter is less coherent than the idea that mind precedes it. Fine-tuning doesn't prove God, but it makes his existence the most elegant and powerful explanation we have.
It's tempting to see design in precision, but that's a psychological impulse, not a logical conclusion. When we see something finely calibrated, like a watch or a spacecraft, we immediately infer a designer. But only because we've seen other watches and spacecraft being made. We have a comparison set. We understand how humans create tools. We do not have a comparison set of universes. We don't know what kinds of laws or constants are normal, or whether this particular set is rare. In fact, some physicists argue that certain values may be interdependent or derivable from deeper principles, not arbitrarily set like a dial on a control panel. So when you say, this seems improbable, you're comparing it to what? We don't even know what the range of possibilities is. Without that, fine-tuning is just a feeling, not a fact. And let's not forget Occam's razor. Explanations should not multiply assumptions beyond necessity. Saying a divine intelligence designed all the constants of physics adds far more assumptions than saying we observe the values we do because life evolved in a universe that permits it. And even if there were a designer, how do we get from fine-tuning to God? What kind of God? Why this God? Why create billions of galaxies just to produce life on one fragile planet after 13.8 billion years? If this is design, it's a strangely wasteful, indirect, and brutal one.
But design can be subtle. Indirection does not equal randomness. And elegance does not require immediacy. You're right that we only infer designers because we know human design. But the inference to intelligence is not limited to artifacts. It applies whenever we encounter complexity ordered toward a goal. DNA is a language. The constants of physics are a framework. The laws of thermodynamics are stable across cosmic time. These are not random patterns. They are structured intelligibility. Even if we discovered a deeper theory from which the constants emerge, that would only strengthen the case for design, because the deeper framework itself would require fine-tuning to exist. We're not just asking why these numbers are this way. We're asking why there's a lawful order at all. And yes, Occam's razor matters, but it doesn't mean choose the simplest story. It means prefer the explanation that accounts for all the data with the fewest assumptions. A multiverse assumes infinite, unobservable realities. A theistic explanation assumes one intelligent cause. And your final question, why such a big universe for such a small purpose, is based on the anthropocentric assumption that size equals importance. That's a human bias, not a philosophical point. The vastness of the cosmos may not be wasteful, it may be the stage upon which freedom, beauty, and moral agency become possible. To say that this astonishing coherence happened for no reason, from no mind, with no explanation, is not scientific humility. It's metaphysical surrender.
Across cultures and centuries, people report encounters with the divine, visions, voices, overwhelming love, transcendent awe. Are these glimpses of a higher reality, or just patterns in the brain? Theon, you begin.
The existence of objective morality is one of the clearest signposts pointing beyond the material world. When we say something is truly wrong, not just unpopular or illegal, but morally wrong, we are appealing to a standard that transcends culture, evolution, and preference. For example, was the Holocaust wrong even if the Nazis believed it was justified? Is child torture wrong even if an entire society accepted it? If your answer is yes, then you believe that some things are objectively, universally evil. But where can such objective moral values come from in a purely naturalistic world? Evolution can explain why we feel moral impulses, but not whether those impulses are actually true. Social contract theory can explain consensus, but not rightness. And neuroscience can map brain states, but not moral obligations. If morality is real, it must be grounded in something beyond human opinion, in a moral lawgiver whose nature defines good itself. As C.S. Lewis argued, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. God's existence is not just compatible with moral realism, it's the best explanation for why moral truths exist at all. Without God, there may be preferences, instincts, or laws, but not real justice, real rights, or real wrongs. The human cry for justice is not a glitch in evolution. It is an echo of something eternal.
The argument from morality relies on a dangerous illusion, the idea that goodness must come from authority. Let's be clear, we do experience moral instincts. We feel guilt, empathy, outrage, but those feelings evolve to help social species cooperate. Morality is not handed down from on high. It is built up from the needs of sentient beings navigating a shared world. Objective moral truths can exist without invoking a god, just like objective mathematical truths exist without invoking a divine mathematician. Suffering is bad because it thwarts flourishing. Justice is good because it promotes equality, dignity, and trust. We can build a secular moral framework grounded in well-being, reciprocity, and reason. Sam Harris calls this the moral landscape, where some ways of living objectively lead to more human flourishing than others. And invoking God introduces serious problems. Whose God defines morality? What about divine commands that endorse genocide, slavery, or misogyny in Scripture? Is something good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's good? That's the Euthyphro dilemma, and it hasn't gone away. We don't need a divine authority to recognize that rape is wrong. We don't need cosmic permission to fight for human rights. Morality is not proof of God. It is proof that sentient creatures can reason, feel, and choose.
You've made a powerful case for moral psychology, not moral reality. Yes, evolution explains why we feel certain moral instincts, but it doesn't explain why we should act on them, even when it costs us. Take the example of sacrificing your life for a stranger. Evolution can't account for such radical altruism, nor can it explain moral guilt, the sense that we've violated something sacred even when no one else is watching. Your comparison to mathematics is interesting, but flawed. Math describes necessary truths about quantities and logic, not about value or duty. Morality makes claims like, "You ought not do this. You should protect the innocent." That oughtness cannot be reduced to brain chemistry or game theory. And the Euthyphro dilemma? Easily addressed. God does not invent morality arbitrarily. Goodness flows from his unchanging nature, a nature that is perfectly just, loving, and holy. So God is not above morality nor beneath it. He is its foundation. Without that foundation, we are left with moral preferences masquerading as truth. You may oppose oppression or cruelty, but in a godless universe, you have no reason to call them wrong, only unpleasant or counterproductive. The moment you say, "This is evil," you step onto sacred ground.
No. The moment you say this is evil, you step into human experience. You argue that moral oughts require God, but that's only if you define morality as a set of divine imperatives. What if morality is about minimizing suffering and maximizing flourishing for conscious beings? That's not arbitrary, that's grounded in reality. You say altruism is inexplicable under evolution, but it's not. Evolution favors not just individual survival, but inclusive fitness, cooperation, and kin selection. Group survival improves when individuals sacrifice for others. And guilt? It's a social mechanism. It keeps tribes together. It punishes selfishness. What you call sacred is what I call social, and there's nothing wrong with that. Your framework also fails on its own terms. If God's nature defines good, then we're still stuck asking, why is God's nature good? Why not a cruel God? Why not a deceptive one? If your answer is because that would be bad, you're relying on a moral standard outside of God. Morality works without gods. And when it needs defending, it's usually from people who believe they're acting for one.
You can measure a brain. You can scan neurons, track chemicals, and map thought to biology. But consciousness, that inner world of experience, remains a mystery. Does the mind point to a soul, or is it just what matter does when arranged a certain way? Syra, you begin.
The mind feels mysterious, but mystery is not evidence of magic. Consciousness is the product of physical processes in the brain. We know this because when the brain changes, consciousness changes. Damage the frontal lobe and personality shifts, alter brain chemistry and emotions follow. Put someone under anesthesia and their awareness disappears, then returns when the drug wears off. If the soul were independent, why would it flicker on and off with neural activity? The hard problem of consciousness, explaining subjective experience, is real, but we don't fully understand it yet does not justify saying it's immaterial. Science has solved every previous mystery of the body without appealing to non-physical causes. Why should the mind be different? Furthermore, neuroscientific advances have already begun to map how attention, memory, decision-making, and even moral judgment arise from the brain. There is no gap where a soul is needed, just unanswered questions. And if consciousness did come from a soul, how would that work? How does an immaterial thing interact with neurons? Where is the interface? The soul explanation creates more problems than it solves. Our experiences are real, but they emerge from the brain. That's the simplest, most consistent model. And until something more compelling arises, we don't need to multiply substances to explain what neurons already do.
Yet despite all that neural mapping, one thing remains untouched: experience itself. You can measure every electrical signal in the brain and still never touch what it feels like to see red or hear music or love someone. That interior reality called qualia is not reducible to chemistry or computation. The fact that consciousness is correlated with brain activity doesn't prove it's caused by it, any more than a piano key proves the existence of the melody. The brain may be an instrument, but it does not explain the player. The hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers puts it, is not about how the brain functions. It's about why those functions are accompanied by experience at all. Why isn't the brain just a silent machine processing data with no awareness? Physicalist models can't answer that. Furthermore, the idea that consciousness evolved for survival is deeply problematic. Self-awareness, introspection, and abstract moral reasoning do not increase reproductive fitness in any obvious way. They're over-engineered if survival is the only goal. But they make perfect sense if humans were designed to reflect, to choose, even to worship. Scripture describes human beings as body and soul, material and immaterial. Genesis 2:7 says, "The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." This duality isn't superstition, it's existential observation. You are not just a brain. You are a self, and selves do not emerge from matter alone.
But you've just renamed the mystery. You haven't solved it. You say the brain is an instrument, and the soul is the player, but where is the player? How does something non-physical influence synapses without energy, matter, or mechanism? The soul has no explanatory power. It's a placeholder for ignorance, a poetic way of saying, we don't know. You also suggest that survival doesn't explain consciousness, but that's a misreading of evolution. Higher-order consciousness allows simulation of future events, complex social navigation, long-term planning, and language, all of which do increase fitness. Just because a trait is complex doesn't mean it's unnecessary. As for qualia, yes, subjective experience is hard to explain, but difficulty is not disproof. If we gave up on natural explanations every time we hit a hard problem, we'd still be invoking Zeus for thunder. And quoting Genesis doesn't strengthen your case, it shows the circularity of it. You believe in the soul because the Bible says it's real, but the Bible assumes a soul to begin with. I don't deny that consciousness is mysterious, but a mystery explained by more mystery is no explanation at all.
Yet it is precisely the uniqueness of consciousness that demands a deeper source. You say the soul adds no explanatory power. But what physical explanation accounts for free will, or intentionality, the mind's ability to refer to things outside itself, or the unity of consciousness, a single I that persists across changing brain states? Materialist theories must explain how electrochemical signals produce a unified first-person perspective, and they haven't. You asked how something immaterial could affect the brain. But causation doesn't require physical contact. Information influences matter all the time. A thought, intangible, can trigger a heartbeat. Why should the immaterial be excluded if it behaves consistently? Also, your model commits a category error. You're treating the mind like an object. But consciousness is subjectivity itself. It cannot be found in a lab because the observer is what's being observed. That's not a failure of science, it's a boundary of method. And on Genesis, my point isn't to use Scripture as proof, but to show that this view of human nature is ancient, intuitive, and philosophically coherent. The soul explains what the materialist view can only describe. You can cut open a brain. You will never find a thought.
Across cultures and centuries, people report encounters with the divine, visions, voices, overwhelming love, transcendent awe. Are these glimpses of a higher reality, or just patterns in the brain? Theon, you begin.
The experience of God is among the most widespread and deeply transformative phenomena in human history. From Moses at the burning bush to the mystics of medieval Christianity, from Sufi poets to modern near-death experiences, people across time, geography, and culture report encounters that radically reorient their lives. These are not isolated hallucinations. They often come with moral clarity, overwhelming beauty, and lasting psychological healing. William James, in The Varieties of Religious Experience, noted their striking consistency across traditions and their power to reshape character. If even one of these experiences is genuine, if even one person has truly encountered something beyond themselves, then materialism is false. A single data point changes the whole map. Of course, not every spiritual experience is valid, just as not every eyewitness is reliable. But when millions across history describe the same pattern, a presence beyond them, often described as light, love, or holiness, we should not dismiss that as brain noise. Science has tried to reduce these experiences to neurology. It's just the temporal lobe. It's just serotonin. But this commits a category error. Just because experiences have a biological correlate doesn't mean they are biologically caused. When you see a sunset, neurons fire in your brain, but that doesn't mean the sunset is inside your skull. Religious experience is evidence. It is subjective, yes, but so is all conscious perception, and the consistency, depth, and fruit of these encounters point not to delusion, but to something real.
Religious experiences are real, but that doesn't make them true. People experience all kinds of powerful mental states: visions, voices, euphoria, terror, a sense of oneness. But experiencing something doesn't prove it corresponds to external reality. Hallucinations feel real. Dreams feel real. Schizophrenia feels real. LSD trips can feel more real than reality. What do all these have in common? The brain. We now understand that mystical states can be reliably triggered by fasting, chanting, sensory deprivation, or psychedelics, all of which alter brain chemistry. This tells us that religious experiences are biologically mediated, and if they arise from brain states, they don't require a supernatural source. The diversity of religious experiences also undermines the argument. Christians experience Jesus. Hindus experience Krishna. Muslims hear Allah. Some people meet glowing aliens. If these were glimpses of the same reality, we'd expect more convergence, not cultural projection. This suggests not that we're tuning into a divine frequency, but that our brains are generating the signal from within. And yes, religious experiences can transform lives, but so can art, music, love, or loss. That doesn't make them supernatural. We must be careful not to confuse depth with truth or meaning with metaphysics. A beautiful illusion is still an illusion.
You're confusing mechanism with meaning. Yes, brain states are involved. All perception involves the brain. But the question is not whether religious experiences use the brain. It's whether they reveal something beyond it. By your logic, we should doubt everything mediated by neural activity, including reason itself. That's self-defeating. The reliability of the mind is either trustworthy or it isn't. And the diversity you mentioned doesn't disprove a transcendent source. It reflects cultural interpretation, not the core phenomenon. Strip away the surface language, and we find shared features: a sense of presence, awe, peace, moral awakening, and a collapse of ego. These are reported in Christian monasteries, Buddhist temples, and Amazonian ayahuasca ceremonies. What unites them is a claim that something more exists, something sacred, real, and personal. And when people return from these states permanently changed, more loving, less afraid of death, more devoted to truth, we should pause before waving it all away as chemistry. Even in a court of law, consistent eyewitness testimony across time and culture carries evidential weight. Why not here?
Because there's a difference between seeing a car accident and claiming to meet God. Eyewitness testimony is valuable in ordinary cases, not in extraordinary ones. When people claim to hear divine voices or leave their bodies, the bar for evidence must rise. And anecdote is not data. Yes, spiritual experiences often share emotional features: peace, unity, awe. But those are precisely the states we expect when brain areas tied to ego, time, and self-processing are disrupted. That's what psychedelics do. That's what deep meditation does. That's what electrical stimulation of the temporal lobe does. The cross-cultural similarity proves the brain's role, not God's. As for moral transformation, it's real, but it cuts both ways. People also kill in the name of visions. They reject science, demonize outsiders, or martyr themselves because they believe their experience was divine. Powerful feelings are not evidence, they are persuasion. And if you're saying, even one true experience disproves atheism, I'll say this. If even one hallucination is possible, even one cultural delusion, then the argument from experience collapses.
Children suffer, innocents die. Nature kills without mercy. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does he allow it? This is not just a philosophical dilemma. It is personal, existential, and urgent. Syra, you begin.
If God exists, and is both all-powerful and all-loving, then the existence of gratuitous suffering is a fatal contradiction. Consider a child dying slowly from bone cancer. What lesson is being taught? What character is being built? What higher purpose could justify such agony? You might say free will explains moral evil, but natural evil is untouched by that defense. Earthquakes, genetic disorders, famines, and tsunamis are not moral choices. They're features of the system, a system supposedly designed by an all-wise being. An omnipotent God could have created a world with free will and less suffering, one without malaria, one without parasitic worms that eat the eyes of children. The scope and scale of suffering make it implausible that this world is the best he could do. Some theists argue that suffering builds the soul, that pain refines us. But that only applies if the suffering is understood, bearable, and redemptive. What about infants who die in pain, animals torn apart in nature, billions who suffer with no lesson, no justice, and no end? And when no explanation is found, the fallback is always mystery. But mystery is not an answer. If you saw a parent allowing this kind of harm and said, "Well, I'm sure they have a higher purpose," you'd be complicit in the abuse. If an all-powerful, all-good being exists, then this world, with all its horrors, is either what he wanted or what he allowed. And neither version is comforting.
There is no denying the depth of human suffering. But the existence of suffering does not logically contradict the existence of a morally perfect, all-powerful God. To begin with, consider what you're doing when you call suffering wrong. You're appealing to a moral standard, something higher than pain or survival. But in a purely material universe, where all things are the product of blind forces, what is suffering but chemistry? A tragedy only exists if there's a way the world ought to be, and that requires a moral reality beyond physics. Now to the question itself, why would a good God allow evil? The first answer is freedom. A world of moral agency, where love, courage, loyalty, and justice are possible, must also be a world where those things can be betrayed. Real choice means the real possibility of evil. You might say, why not less freedom? But how much should be removed? At what cost? If we remove all capacity to harm, we remove all capacity to choose meaningfully. What about natural evil? Earthquakes, disease, and death. Here, the theist doesn't claim to know all the reasons, but we can observe that many of the same processes that cause suffering are also the very ones that make life possible. Tectonic activity produces habitable land. Biological evolution enables intelligence. Even aging and death may be conditions that allow for renewal, growth, and moral urgency. A stable, lawful, intelligible world, one where free beings can develop, may necessarily include risk and loss. Could a better world have been made? Perhaps, but perhaps not without erasing the very goods we hold most dear: consciousness, freedom, love, and the ability to grow. In the end, the theist doesn't say all suffering is understood, only that it may be redeemable, and that meaning and morality still hold, even in the face of pain.
You're defending the unimaginable. You say suffering is a trade-off, part of the structure of a free and ordered world. But you're describing a designed system. If the structure results in the drowning of entire villages or millions dying from disease, then either the designer is limited or morally indifferent. You suggest that suffering is necessary for growth. But for whom? What is an infant's death building? What virtue is being formed in a deer torn apart by predators? Most suffering on this planet doesn't result in moral transformation. It just happens, brutally, pointlessly, and then ends. And when that becomes hard to explain, you say, "We don't know the reason, but there may be one." That's not logic. That's theology without evidence. You asked where morality comes from on atheism, but I don't need a deity to say that pain is bad. I need only empathy. If I burn my hand, I don't need a cosmic law to know I should avoid it and prevent it in others. Morality is rooted in conscious experience. No God required. If God exists and created this system, then he allowed all of it: birth defects, war crimes, famine, rape, slow death. If humans did this, we'd call it evil. If a God does it, we call it mysterious? That's not moral reasoning. That's moral surrender.
Your anger is justified, but your framework removes any grounding for it. You say morality comes from empathy, but empathy varies. Cultures differ. Some feel nothing for others at all. Why should one brain's pain signal dictate moral law for the universe? Without a transcendent source, morality is just preference, and your protest against suffering becomes no more significant than a shudder at bad weather. Now, about the scale of suffering. You argue that a better world is possible. But let me ask, better by what standard? Fewer tears, less death, certainly. But perhaps a world with no suffering would also be a world with no real depth, no urgency, no sacrifice, and no meaning. If death were impossible and pain never touched us, would we grow? Would we love as fiercely? Would we make anything of consequence? You raise the problem of animals. It's true we don't fully know why animals suffer, but we also don't fully understand consciousness itself. The moral status of non-human suffering is part of a wider mystery, one that doesn't dissolve theism but simply humbles us. The theist does not deny the horror, but we insist that horror alone doesn't make this world meaningless. Pain can destroy, but it can also awaken. Grief can shatter, but it can also open the heart to love, humility, and wisdom. Even the worst evils can, in some cases, lead to astonishing resilience and beauty. That doesn't make suffering good. It makes it capable of serving something greater. In a cold universe, suffering is noise. In a created one, it may be refined into meaning, not always seen, not always understood, but possible.
If God is real and wants a relationship with us, why is he so hard to find? Why do sincere seekers meet silence? And why does faith feel like guesswork? For many, the absence of God's presence is more powerful than any argument. Theon, you begin.
This is not a cold academic question. The experience of divine silence is among the most honest and painful objections to belief in God. If God is real, why does he seem hidden? First, let's be precise. God's hiddenness is not total absence. Billions across history have claimed to encounter the divine, not only mystics and monks, but everyday people. In suffering, in awe, in love, in conscience. The question is not whether anyone has ever sensed God's presence, but why some do and others do not. A theist might offer this: if God wants beings who can freely choose relationship with him, he must preserve what philosophers call epistemic distance. That means leaving the world ambiguous enough that belief is not compelled, yet meaningful enough that belief is rational. Too much presence, and belief becomes coercion. Too little, and belief becomes absurd. The balance matters. A world where God is searchable, but not unavoidably visible, allows for genuine freedom. The freedom to seek, ignore, wrestle, or surrender. That kind of freedom is morally and spiritually significant. It is the difference between a hostage and a lover. Second, hiddenness may serve a purpose beyond proof. If God is not merely a fact to be acknowledged, but a being to be known, then he may choose to reveal himself not through overwhelming power, but through personal transformation, often gradually, quietly, and in ways we only understand in hindsight. The silence of God may be space, not absence. Space for choice, space for growth, space for longing. And longing itself can be a kind of evidence, a hunger that hints at a reality beyond the material.
Let's step back and ask the obvious. If an all-loving, all-powerful being wanted people to believe, to know him, love him, obey him, then why not make himself unmistakably known? If belief in God is the most important fact of existence, why hide behind ambiguity? You say God's hiddenness protects our freedom, but we don't apply that logic anywhere else. I know gravity exists. That doesn't make me a robot. I know my friends exist. I still choose how to treat them. Clarity doesn't cancel freedom. It gives it direction. More importantly, people suffer over this. There are sincere seekers, people who beg, cry, and ache for God to reveal himself and receive only silence. Are we to believe that this silence is love? You argue that ambiguity makes belief meaningful. I argue it makes faith indistinguishable from self-deception. If people from every religion claim spiritual experiences, often contradictory ones, then hiddenness isn't a feature, it's a problem. A truly loving God would not make his presence easier to find in hallucinations and traditions than in reality. We don't demand proof because we're arrogant. We demand it because extraordinary claims, like an all-knowing mind that created the universe and loves us, require extraordinary evidence. And yet, what we get is silence.
You ask why God doesn't make himself obvious. But what counts as obvious? Would writing in the sky convince everyone? Perhaps. But would it foster trust, humility, depth of character? We often act as if we would believe, if only God were clearer. But belief isn't the same as love. Knowing that someone exists doesn't mean you trust them. It doesn't mean you submit your will or open your heart. Maybe God seeks not just belief in his existence, but relationship with his nature. And that requires more than sensory certainty. It requires willingness. Also, you spoke of sincere seekers. Yes, some experience silence, but others encounter profound awareness, comfort, even presence. You call that projection. I call it a data point. Perhaps the difference is not God's absence, but human openness, timing, or readiness. Or perhaps his ways are simply not reducible to our expectations. The fact that people have diverse views of the divine doesn't invalidate the possibility of God's existence. It shows how varied our perceptions are. But perception is not the standard of reality. Reality can be misinterpreted, but still real. Hiddenness is not always a defect. Sometimes it is restraint, the space between whisper and thunder where freedom actually lives.
But you're still offering excuses for absence. You say too much presence would overwhelm our freedom. But again, clarity isn't coercion. I know the law exists, but I'm free to obey or break it. I know the sun exists, but I'm free to live in its light or hide from it. Presence doesn't force relationship. It simply makes it possible. You suggest God's hiddenness protects our moral development, but would a clearer God really prevent virtue, or would he make love stronger, rooted in shared knowledge, not guessing games? And when you say seekers may not be ready or open, that becomes indistinguishable from victim blaming. Now it's our fault God doesn't show up? A parent who hides from their child to encourage independence isn't loving, they're negligent. And when billions of people cry out and hear nothing, when the default state of the universe is silence, that isn't sacred space. That's abandonment dressed up as mystery. You can interpret the silence however you want, but if there's a God behind it, he hides better than the universe he supposedly created.
Before you cast your vote, hear their final word. This is the moment where beliefs are tested and clarity matters most. Let's hear the final judgments. Theon, you begin.
We have explored contingency, consciousness, morality, beauty, and suffering. And in every case, theism offers a deeper explanation than materialism ever could. A universe with no foundation cannot explain its own existence. A brain with no purpose cannot explain mind. A morality with no anchor cannot explain obligation. And a life with no meaning cannot explain the ache for more. You can dismiss each of these longings as illusions, or you can treat them as signs, signs that point beyond the physical to something necessary, eternal, and good. Is belief in God difficult? Sometimes. But difficulty does not mean irrationality. It means we are dealing with something vast, not imaginary. God may be hidden, but the clues are everywhere. In the order of the cosmos, the hunger of the soul, the cry for justice, and the stubborn persistence of hope. Atheism can describe the world. Theism explains why it matters.
The universe is vast, beautiful, and indifferent. We do not need a divine author to explain its structure. Physics does that. We do not need a cosmic judge to explain morality. Empathy and evolution do that. We do not need a soul to explain the mind. Neuroscience does that. Every mystery once credited to gods, thunder, disease, even life itself, has gradually been brought into the light of reason. And God keeps retreating into the gaps. But gaps are not evidence. They are invitations to think harder. I don't deny the ache for meaning or the desire for justice. But longing doesn't prove destination. Comfort does not equal truth. If God exists, he has hidden himself behind the same silence that surrounds every myth. And if he does not exist, the silence makes perfect sense. We don't need certainty to live well. We need honesty. And the honest answer is, we don't see God because he's not there.
You've heard both sides. Now the choice is yours. Did Theon make the stronger case for a necessary, moral, personal creator behind the universe? Or did Sira show that science, logic, and the silence of the cosmos point to a godless reality? Let us know by casting your vote in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next clash. Because every debate brings you closer to the truth behind today's hardest choices.